You've heard the news, right? Starting next year, Unity will be charging a brand new runtime fee on top of their existing prices. And game devs all over Twitter are outraged, which they 100% have a right to be. This system is deeply flawed, and it sets a dangerous precedent for Unity doing whatever they want in terms of pricing, whether that's bumping up the install fee to $50 or anything else. Will this change last? Who knows? We're not here to predict the future. I'm here to try and answer the question of, what should you and I, as indie devs, do now? And the short answer to that question is, it depends. But today I'll be looking at a few aspects of that question to help you make a better decision. First off, should you switch to Godot? And if so, how would you do that? When I first heard about the decision, since #Unity3D was trending on Twitter, the first thing I did was not download Godot. Instead, I looked for the installation of Godot that I'd already downloaded a few months ago, along with the C# extension. It's a little out of date, but it's Godot 4, so it'll do. I decided that for a small initial prototype, I could remake this game called Cray Flyer that I made in middle school computer class following a tutorial on code.org. It's a very simple arcade game where you tilt left and right and fly forward to try and grab a coin while avoiding a monster. I could have tried to make a bit of a larger game, but this one was simple enough and I could add more features if I was interested. To remake it, I started out by recreating the sprite for the little flyer himself and the coin he collects. Then I imported these into Godot and started trying to figure out how to move them around. Inputting Godot is a little tricky, though it's simpler on the whole than in Unity. If you just use the _input method to process the input event and only act when a key is pressed, you'll find that you can only recognize one key at a time, and the action only repeats if you hold the key. It's sort of like pressing backspace in a word processor. If you press it once, it just backspaces once, but if you hold it for a while, it starts to backspace repeatedly. To fix this, first create a variable for if the key was just pressed. You can also use this method for Godot's input maps, by the way. Then set the variable to true if the input event that occurred was the key being pressed, and false if the event was the key being released. There's an easy way to do this in just 2 lines, by the way. If you want an action to occur only when the key is initially pressed down, you can do it like this. And these two methods work together too. After I'd gotten the basic controls to work the way I wanted, I started on some UI. Nothing fancy, just some hearts and a score counter. UI in Godot is fairly similar to Unity, but just with fewer options. It's made of a tree of control nodes, which have a variety of different functions, but all I needed was a simple margin container, which allows you to put elements towards the corner of the screen, similar to Unity's rect transform system. For the hearts, I just used a string of ASCII heart characters, which render as sprites. Next up was the collision with the coin. Whenever the player touches the coin, it should move to a random position on the screen, a certain distance away from the player. Moving the coin was simple. The hard part was figuring out the collision. Basically, Godot has nodes called rigid body 2D and collision shape 2D, similar to Unity. To set up 2D collision on an existing node, just add a rigid body 2D on the node and a collision shape underneath that. Make sure to freeze the rigid body, if you're moving it manually like me, and enable contact monitoring with enough max contacts to detect all the collisions that might be occurring at the same time. For me, just 2. From there, detecting collisions is even simpler than in Unity. Instead of arcane built-in methods, you just attach regular C# events to the rigid bodies. I just added some code to the body entered event in the coin script that checks whether the body belongs to the player, and if so, calls the randomized position function while increasing the score. Coding the evil flyer was similar to the coin. Whenever the player touches it, you lose 1 health, and if your health reaches 0, you lose. I just added a quick rigid body and collision shape, then added some code to the evil flyer's body entered event. I also added a quick title screen and game over screen that shows your high score. Godot is different from Unity in that you're not really discarding everything when you move from one scene to another. Instead, you're encouraged to have a base node in charge of swapping out your scenes. I didn't really need to do any of this though, since I'm not swapping out any of the scenes, just moving the player around and showing or hiding some UI elements. Finally, I moved on to the music and sound effects. The music was nothing special. The audio stream player 2D is pretty similar to Unity's audio player, although I do like how you can set up a custom loop point for each audio stream, which is something I had to code manually for Deck Dojo. Speaking of coding things up, for the sound effects, I decided to try coding up a little more complex algorithm, recreating the sound effect pool I made for Deck Dojo. It was a little more difficult to figure out if it was working since you can't inspect the state of the game while playing like in Unity, but it wasn't too hard with the judicious use of print statements. Exporting the game was pretty easy, except for the fact that HTML5 exporting for C# projects isn't supported yet in Godot 4. So, if you're an indie dev using Unity, should you switch to Godot? Well, again, it depends, but you should definitely learn how to use Godot. If you're familiar enough with Unity, you won't have a problem. And an important aspect to remember is that Godot is open source, which is good for several reasons. First, it's free and will always be free. That's the obvious one, but there's a way bigger implication. While Unity gets improvements in fits and starts, and often with plenty of mistakes lumped in, Godot will improve in quality quadratically. As time goes on, more and more devs will start using Godot Godot, and a certain amount of users will contribute to the engine more and more. Think about it like a formula. Improvements equals number of users times the chance that each user becomes a developer. With Unity, that first number is astronomical, but the second number is extremely low. With Godot, the second number is high and the first number is large and growing as Godot becomes more and more stable. As time goes on, expect to see Godot progressing far more quickly than its closed source alternatives, closing the gap with Unity and Unreal Engine and even surpassing them. If you're skeptical, see this essay by Eric S. Raymond, one of the hackers who led the open source versus Microsoft war in the 1990s. It's thanks to him that every major browser today is built on open source, as well as the internet at large. The same thing is happening with game engines. Hopefully I've convinced you to at least try Godot, but for me and a lot of other game developers, there's a demoralizing reality we have to confront before we can get over that hill. We already have Unity games on the market or in development. The big question here is, should I switch my existing game? Once again, it depends, but this time it's a financial decision. How much money would you lose by switching engines, and how much would you lose by staying with Unity? You may want to finish up whatever Unity project you're working on right now, even rushing it out to market, while creating prototypes for the next one at the same time in Godot or Unreal. As for me, in closing, it all depends. Make the best decision based on what you know. As a developer, and as a gamer, I know that devs will win out one way or another no matter what. I've got some miscellaneous advice from a guy who at least released a game even if I didn't make any money off of it. Fake it till you make it. Don't let anyone tell you anything. Demand visual proof. Bet on the big guys getting controlled by the crowd, not the other way around. Especially when that crowd is controlled. Now I just hope I can edit this video before Unity takes it all back. Have a good day.